Alright, in this second video we'll be focusing on cutting mortises, tenons, making the tongue and grooves for the field panels. And here, just getting started, after all the boards were cut the length in the last video, I'm clamping them to my workbench. I'm going to be using my router with a 1/2 inch diameter bit. That's about 2.5 inches long. It's somewhat scary to use with how long it is, but it does a great job for making these large mortises. This gives you a good shot of what my sub base looks like on my router for doing these mortises. It's a large piece of acrylic with some slots cut in it, and then 2 pieces of hardwood that act as the inside and outside face, making sure my router doesn't move when I'm making these mortises. Another thing you probably can't tell is one of the faces of this board is marked with an O for outside, and I'm making sure that the same guide on my router is always against that fence, just in case if I'm not perfectly centered left or right, at least they'll all be consistent. Alright, after making rounded corner mortises, it's time to chisel them square. So I'm grabbing my 1/2 inch chisel here, and I probably have a smaller one, maybe a 3/8 chisel on my bench to help clean it out, but just squaring up the ends. The next step here I'm doing here is marking out all of the tenon shoulders. I'm using just a simple square and a marking knife. One thing I am making sure is that I'm always referencing the square against 2 of the surfaces, not all 4. And those surfaces are typically the front face, the exterior face, and then one of the edges, either top or bottom. And they typically correspond to the surfaces that I jointed. The tenons will be 2 inches long. I think they're probably, I don't know how tall they are, I can't recall, but they're then a 1/2 inch wide, like I mentioned with the 1/2 inch router bit. After laying out the tenons with the knife, I then come back with a dado stack in the table saw, and I set my fence to a point where I just about get to my knife line on the tenons. And so what I was showing before is that knife line still exists. And so what I'm doing here is I'm removing most of the material, getting it very close, leaving it just a little bit fat, and I come back with a set of chisels and a shoulder plane to custom fit each one into the mortises. I typically set up this cut on my bandsaw to cut the, what would be the, not the shoulders, but the maybe the nose and the back of the neck of the tenon. But I was feeling like in a hand tool mood today when I did this, so I cut them by hand, and then here I'm paring to my knife line with a chisel and just cleaning up the shoulders. And here I am using my shoulder plane to remove a little bit of material on the tenon cheeks, and as well if there's any type of inconsistencies along the shoulder, which there really isn't, but there's a couple, I'll clean them up with the shoulder plane as well, and then I'll test them to fit on the long rail you see on the opposite side of my workbench. The next process I'm going through here, the dado stack is still in my table saw set at 1/4 inch, and I'm making all of the grooves that are on the internal perimeter of the door, so on the inside of all the long rails as well as all the short horizontal rails, and that's where the field boards will have a corresponding tongue to fit in them. First I did the short ones, and now I'm moving on to the long boards. You can see I have a feather board helping me keep the board against the fence, especially those long ones. Helps to have that extra set of hands there. Slightly off camera here, you can see that I'm dry fitting the long vertical rails and the short horizontal rails together, just to make sure, do one last final check and to make sure all those grooves I just cut line up. And here's a quick shot showing that groove along the perimeter and how they are nicely aligned. Marking one of the surfaces of the board and keeping that against the fence on all the pieces just helps make sure everything goes back together and everything's lined up nicely. With the same dado stack in the saw, the 1/4 inch, I move on to cutting the grooves for the field boards that are in the internal parts of the door. I'm just doing one pass, I'm not flipping it around. I made sure when I set up my saw that it was perfectly centered on these boards. Here you can see all the grooves cut, and then I'm cutting these boards to length, making sure I account for the small tongues that'll be on each end to fit inside the corresponding grooves. The next step here is to cut the boards to a width, and I had to work this out on paper first because I wanted all the boards to be consistent widths. I didn't want to have a sliver at the very end or have a board or need a board that was larger than what I had already purchased. So working out on paper first helped me get a rough width, and then that last board per row that will have a tongue on each side will have to be cut down in width just a little bit to make it fit, but it's going to look consistent. Now it was time to route the tongues in the end of the boards. What I have here is a 3/4 inch diameter, just like a 2 or 3 flute straight bit in the router table. And I've already set up the depth and the distance from the fence using a bunch of scraps. All those cutoffs from cutting them to length, I used probably about 5 or 6 or even more than that to get the fit right. And to be completely honest, a couple of them still were a little tight. I had hit them with the shoulder plane, but the majority of them fit nicely. So now that all the tongue and grooves were cut, I also cut the tongues in the very ends of the board to fit into the horizontal rails. And here is how I'm keeping the spacing between all the panel or the tongue groove boards consistent with those 1/4 inch space balls. I also am putting them in the ends to keep a consistent gap top and bottom as well. So here I'm dry fitting everything so I can mark and cut the very last board in the row. That'll get a tongue on both sides. Here I'm marking the board to width, and I'm going to rip it on my table saw and then take it over to the router table and cut the tongue on the end that was just cut off. And here I'm making sure upon compressing those space balls a little bit, the only thing sticking past the tenon shoulder is that tongue. Well, that does it for this video. Thanks for watching. In the next video, I'll get to glue up, final sanding, and finishing.